So without further ado, we'll get to our lecture for tonight. So we're lucky to have Ken Egan with us here, and he's going to be going through history lessons from A River Runs Through It. So Ken taught American literature for 30 years at colleges and universities, both in the United States and abroad. And then after that, he served as executive director for Humanities Montana. Since retiring, he's been working on some writing, such as composing a biography of his Irish-American great-grandfather. And he's begun work on Montana at the Crossroads, the crown of the continent in 4 acts. And some of his earlier works include Hope and Dread in Montana Literature, and Montana 1864, Indians, Emigrants, and Gold in the Territorial Year. So we're very lucky to have Ken with us tonight in this very interesting topic. So welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So great to see everybody. How's my volume? About right? About right. Good. Thank you. Very good news. I'm very honored to be asked by the Montana Historical Society to participate in their lecture series. I'm thrilled to be here in this beautiful library. And if I say nothing else tonight, it is please, please, please support our cultural institutions in all ways you can. Please, please. So, with that in mind, I do want to announce that I'm going to donate my honorarium for speaking to both the Lewis and Clark Library and the Montana Historical Society, and I hope many of you will join me in that. So, thank you, thank you. Now, I do want to make a point. I want to emphasize my email address is up there for a reason. I love hearing from folks. I have a hunch that what I'm sharing tonight will stimulate, puzzle, inspire, and please feel free to write to me through that email address and just communicate with me, particularly if you hear mistakes or misreadings or stuff like that. This is part of a book project, as I'll explain shortly. So in many ways, this is what I might call pre-writing for a book, so please help me out. I do have a Substack, and I mainly list it because that's where I do a lot of my pre-writing. And if you're just curious about some of the work I'm doing right now on Montana literature, you can find a lot of it at my Substack. So, without further ado, why am I here? We are on the cusp of the 50th anniversary of the publication of A River Runs Through It and Other Stories. And I have to admit, it's kind of a shock to me to realize that I get very nostalgic. I got a first edition of this book in 1976. To this day, I can't recall if it was a gift or if I picked it up, I bought it or something. But that blue cover has just stuck in my mind as emblematic of A River Runs Through It. And I suppose there's a sort of almost a connection with water, blue waters, etc. So you might notice a blue theme running through my presentation tonight, and I will admit that is intentional. That, of course, is Norman Maclean. I love this photo of him. There are many, many photos of him. This is my favorite. It was actually taken by his son-in-law, Joel Snyder. And I think it kind of captures that combination of toughness. You're going to see toughness is a big issue for him. There's definitely a contemplative quality to that photograph. He's, of course, presumably at his beloved Seeley Lake there. So Norman Maclean, and we're on the cusp of the 50th anniversary. So before I launch into what I'm interested in, the historical lessons from A River Runs Through It and Other Stories, I just want to give you a brief overview of kind of the canonical readings of the book. And you all should feel free to throw out your own, by the way, and do feel free to ask questions as we go or just share thoughts. So here are some of the sort of standard, if you will, compelling readings of A River Runs Through It to date. A lyrical guide to fly fishing. I think we'll agree on that one, right? I note one critic in particular, Nick Lyons. He published one of the very first reviews of A River Runs Through It, and he just couldn't say enough good things about it as a guide to fly fishing. Nick himself was an English professor who loved fly fishing. So, lyrical guide to fly fishing. It's a love song for pre-World War II Montana. And in this case, I'm using the Robert Redford film as the sample text, the example. I think you'd agree with me on that. Isn't that film just saturated with nostalgia, right? It's got all those sepia tones and very much a very loving reconstruction of the material culture, the musical culture, et cetera, of that time period. Tragedy of a brother's death. And in this case, I'm calling on my good friend O. Allen Weltzing, a very important scholar of Norman Maclean, as we'll see as we go through this talk, actually. But Maclean claimed that tragedy was the highest form of art, and that on occasion, life actually becomes tragic art. It actually turns into a moment of such clarification and loss and pain and revelation that we have to tell that story. And of course, in many ways, Paul's story in A River Runs Through It is that kind of tragic text. And then an aging writer's triumph. And this happens to be my current favorite, for reasons you might guess. But Maclean, it's a fascinating story if you don't know it. Maclean tried mightily to write and publish work well before A River Runs Through It. He particularly became obsessed with the Custer myth and researched it extensively, drafted quite a bit of prose about it, and he hit a wall. And ultimately, he found ways to use that earlier writing. But anyway, by the time he turned 70 and he retired from teaching, he said, it's time, I've got to get something down in print. I've got to succeed as a writer. And we have this triumph, this book. Not to mention Young Men in Fire, which I won't talk about tonight, but we'll agree that's pretty good too. So in any case, I love thinking about him as an aging writer who found his voice, found his media, found means to tell a great story. You'll notice I'm listing particular scholars or critics. At the end of the talk, I will give you my works cited, so we'll return to that, okay? Okay, so 50 years of thinking hard about this great book. Here are some of the readings. I want to take a different approach to it. Montana at the Crossroads, our state as a paradigm of change and conflict. When I was introduced, you got a kind of gaudy title for a book I'm trying to draft called Montana at the Crossroads, the Crown of the Continent in 4 Acts. And what I'm interested in is seeing Montana as a place where many of the conflicts that currently are in play, that I'll say kind of plague our contemporary culture, many of those are on display in Montana. I think an obvious reason is COVID-19. We had the single largest influx of new citizens, or settlers, so to speak, in 20 to 21, and then 21 to 22. So about 20,000 people, particularly in the first phase. And the COVID-19 influx has obviously brought in a lot of new folks. I think it's caused a fair amount of conflict. I think it's brought a lot of new energy. I mean, I want to be positive as well. But I think there are reasons why this place, our last best place, has become a paradigm for conflict and change. The Yellowstone mania. I don't have to talk about this very much, do I? True story. So our son married into a lovely British family, and he actually lives near them in the Lake District of England. And we went to visit the family, our British in-laws, in October. And among the very first things they said to us was, "We love Yellowstone. We love Yellowstone. We watch every episode. It means everything to us." And Terry and I, my wife and I, we sort of like, that's kind of an unrealistic view of where we live. They said, no, you got to own it. So anyway, Yellowstone, I think it's fair to say Yellowstone raises certain stereotypical images or myths that we're all dealing with. There's a surge of great books right now. I hope you're aware of some of these, and happy to talk about them later if you'd like. Billionaire Wilderness, The Crazies, Holding Fire, Old King, Becoming Little Shell, Dream State, I could go on. But writers right now are observing our state, and they're recognizing some of these strains, these conflicts over land use, over what is the best use of our public lands in particular. What about the housing crisis, et cetera. And then dramatic test cases that are getting a lot of national coverage. You're probably aware of this, but the American prairie, that incredible, wild, strange, beautiful idea of creating a bison reserve up in Missouri Breaks country, that's another issue which I hear about a lot when I travel out of state. And so that's become another kind of paradigm, if you will, that is a test case for what is the West, what is the new West. So with all of this going on, I decided I wanted to go back to Norman Maclean, and I thought, what would it be like to reread A River Runs Through It through the lens of these contemporary issues? And what I discovered, and I bet many of you already discovered this, I don't think I'm highly original in this. What you discover is that Maclean actually very carefully wove through his stories a great deal of history. It's a way of accounting for what's happened here, who's been here before, and it's also a way, I think, of hinting at ongoing conflicts and challenges, particularly for young men. And that's a theme I'll hit pretty hard. So, here is one of the great lines for me. After Norman Maclean published A River Runs Through It, we had the good fortune that he gave a lot of talks, a lot of interviews. And he was incredibly eloquent and thoughtful. So we have those collected and we can turn to those. And I particularly like this particular statement. And I think we'll agree this does hold up as a description of what he's trying to do in A River Runs Through It. They are stories that try to combine, as Western stories often do, the pleasure of an interesting story with a historical record. And as he said on many occasions, I knew Montana history cold because to me it was critical to know Montana history, to know why I became what I became, to understand what became of my brother Paul and others that he characterizes in A River Runs Through It. You'll notice he really emphasizes handcraft. He's particularly proud of that. And what you'll discover when you go into A River Runs Through It, the full collection, you'll discover that there is a kind of probably semi-obvious timeline to it. And what I'm trying to emphasize here, is that in many ways what he's doing is a kind of excavation project through the course of the stories. So the first story, of course, is the most famous of all, the one we all know, the one that Robert Redford made a movie of, etc. And that is A River Runs Through It. And what we learn is that the narrator is 35 at the time. His brother Paul is 32. And it's interesting, he's very precise about that Paul is 32. The reason I emphasize that is Paul died at 32. So we're very much, I think, meant to think about where Paul was at the moment we lost him, or when Norman and his family lost him. By the way, just a quick comment about Maclean's technique. Critics very shrewdly have pointed out Maclean actually combines fiction with nonfiction to create a kind of mixed genre. So much of what we see in the stories actually took place, but Maclean takes poetic license, artistic license to kind of reshape it. So he'll combine a whole bunch of events in one summer. As you probably recall, River Runs Through It is a series of 4 fishing trips one summer, right? And of course, those trips were spread out over many years. And so just an example. Anyway, logging and pimping and your pal Jim, probably my least favorite story, but it's amusing. The narrator is 25 years old, it's 1927, and he's very much part of a logging crew in one of the Anaconda Copper Company camps. And we're gonna see a photo of what that looks like in a little bit, and I think you'll agree, pretty tough conditions. One of the things about Maclean that I really came to admire and kind of be fascinated by is this combination of his Chicago persona. University of Chicago, one of the elite institutions. He is one of the most revered teachers. At the same time, he grew up in this tough Montana world, and he very much wanted to hold on to it. So, and then finally, a very good story. I love that story. USFS 1919. He is all of 17 years old. He's hanging out in with the best packer he's ever known. He's sent off up the mountain because he hasn't acted properly. So he's kind of put out into a timeout up in a fire tower, et cetera. It's a great story. So my point here is that the way the book is structured is itself a kind of historical or personal biographical excavation project. See, so there's histories that were built in. All right, you probably don't need this, but I thought we should just briefly remind ourselves what we're talking about. Where's the heartland? I would describe this as the Maclean heartland. They, of course, have the beautiful cabin up at Seeley Lake, built primarily by his father, his Presbyterian father, minister father, and the whole family. We're going to see a little bit later that Greeno is a very important location. That is probably where he worked in the logging camp for Anaconda Copper Company. Various amusing moments, of course, in Lincoln, in Missoula. And anyway, so think of this as kind of the core, the heart of Maclean country. All right, now we're going to begin history. And what I want to observe here, guys, is I am pulling out a series of passages that highlight historical background for his story, the narrator's story, Paul's story, etc. These are only samples. I think you could literally take a historical moment out of pretty much every page in particularly A River Runs Through It, the first story, because he was so self-conscious about this, so careful about this. This is an absolutely beautiful passage, and what he's getting at here is he's, as it were, he's starting, if you will, to build up these kind of sediments of time and experience. He's building this deep time, this context for his stories. So I'm just going to read the first sentence here, and please listen for the rhythm of it and the color sense of it. Remember that as a University of Chicago professor, that Norman Maclean particularly loved Wordsworth, and he particularly loved Wordsworth's rhythms. And we have a famous story that it was Maclean's mother who taught him to keep time by tapping on tables as he read Shakespeare when he was in high school. Okay, anyway, so I'll just read the first line here. The boulders on the flat were shaped by the last ice age only 18 or 20,000 years ago. But the red and green Precambrian rocks beside the blue water were almost from the basement of the world and time. So he's adding, obviously, a historical element here. This is actual geology. He loved geology, Maclean. But it's also poetry, and it's mythic, isn't it? I think he's creating a mythic context for his stories as well, as though he's connecting the stories of Paul and the narrator and the father and others, connecting to that deep history. And then we get to Glacial Lake Missoula. And I gotta say, of all of the issues that Maclean writes about, I think he really loved Glacial Lake Missoula. I think this was a particular favorite of his because he brings it up fairly often, not just in his stories, but in his interviews. And I'm gonna show you a map in a minute what that looks like, but just a little bit of this just to give you the feel for it. From its headwaters to its mouth, the Blackfoot was manufactured by glaciers. The first 65 miles of it are smashed against the southern wall of its valley by glaciers that moved in from the north, scarifying the earth. Its lower 25 miles were made overnight when the great geological lake covering northwestern Montana and northern Idaho broke its dam and spread the remains of Montana and Idaho. Do you all know about Glacial Lake Missoula, I'm assuming? Yeah. I had a really cool experience this past summer. My wife and I and our in-laws went on a trip out to the coast, out to Vancouver Island, and we finally stopped at that remarkable place in eastern Washington where you can see the evidence of this incredible flood, right? These incredible dry, if you will, waterfall. It's massive. And that was the first time I really thought, okay, I kind of get it now. I kind of get Glacial Lake Missoula now. So here's a handy map, and I want to thank the maker, if you will, the keeper of the website. I believe it's hugeevents.com, something like that. But anyway, this just gives you a good idea of what's going on. So the Blackfoot would be up here, obviously, in here. And when that ice dam breaks, all of that water just explodes out, and it helps shape the very environment that we're witnessing in A River Runs Through It. Montana before history. This is one of my favorite passages in the story, and you'll probably figure out why, so I'll just share it. Paul held his rod straight in front of him, and every now and then he lunged forward with it, perhaps reenacting some glacial race memory in which he speared a hairy Ice Age mastodon and ate him for breakfast. I like that. So in this moment, of course, Maclean is recalling not, deep time, deep geology. He's recalling actual prehistoric humanity. And I hope you know there's a lot of great history being done about that period, particularly the book Montana Before History. It's a great book. Hope you'll get it. So I'm going to put an image on the screen now, and I want you to tell me who you think this might be. Who is that? Can you make it out? It's a little obscure, isn't it? It's kind of silhouette-y. Any guesses who that is? Not Norman. This is Paul. So, that image of him spearing, right? Here we have this amazing photograph. One of the few photographs of Paul actually fishing. And I got to be honest, it's not the most dynamic, perhaps not the most exciting, but I love it. And I have to thank, actually, Norman's son, John Maclean. I borrowed this image, if you will, from his website. So thank you to John for keeping this. But I do think it's critical we get a view of Paul as we move forward through this material. All right, Lewis's journey on the Blackfoot. How many of you knew that Lewis broke off from Clark on the return trip, and Lewis went up the Blackfoot, and then, of course, unfortunately, perhaps, ended up on the Marias River, where he had the encounter at the Blackfeet, which led to all kinds of problems going forward, right? So anyway, again, Maclean was fascinated by this story, and so he wanted to highlight that indeed, here's another historical moment that has occurred along the Blackfoot corridor. And this is kind of a fascinating little text. I'll let you read it for yourself. But it kind of cracks me up because in one sense he's saying, yeah, Lewis went up the Blackfoot, but he wasn't that tough. He's kind of implying here he wasn't that tough. And so I'll let you make of that what you will. Nonetheless, this was kind of an important precursor, if you will, to the Macleans, who moved into Montana when the boys, Paul and Norman, were still young. They, of course, took up residence in Missoula. The father became a leading Presbyterian minister, not just in Missoula, but in the state. So, in a sense, their lives, in some ways, replicate this. So just to give you the flavor of this, I have to go back. I just want to note something here. So you see here, John Maclean, his wonderful book, Home Waters, he reconstructs the whole Lewis expedition along the Blackfoot. And just to be clear, they're following, right, a trail that had been blazed, if you will, by the Nez Perce, by the Salish, by other tribes who are heading out to the plains to hunt the buffalo. So that's what's going on there. So John Maclean's Home Waters, it's an amazing reconstruction he does. And if you ever just get curious, I'm going to do it this summer, and you want to actually follow that route along the river, you can do it. Anyway, here is the first, we believe the first of the campsites for Lewis along the Blackfoot. It's just 10 miles east of Missoula. It's a very easy drive. Some of you may know this. It's a pretty important put-in place along the Blackfoot. Is it Angevine? Anybody knows? I don't know how that's pronounced. Anyway, so again, we can experience Norman Maclean's world. We can experience history even today. Now, I think one of the more fascinating and surprising aspects of my revisiting A River Runs Through It through the lens of history, I was really quite struck and even impressed by how much time and energy Maclean devotes to Native Americans. That surprised me a little bit. It's an ongoing issue for many, understandable, many white writers who I think resist that. They're worried about, first, among other things, being disrespectful, being inaccurate, etc. But actually, there are a surprising number of moments, particularly in the lead story, River Runs Through It, dedicated to that. And for those of you who know the movie, y'all know the movie, right? We all know the movie. This is a character that probably you recall. And so this is the young lady who's with Paul when he's arrested. And he makes a very striking claim. The narrator makes a very striking claim here. Her mother was a Northern Cheyenne, so when her black hair glistened, she was handsome. At least one of her great-grandmothers had been with the Northern Cheyennes when they basically destroyed Custer. Very interesting throwaway line. Here's where you see Norman Maclean recycling all of that research he did about Custer. And you'll feel it not only here, but in Young Men and Fire. Actually, it comes up fairly frequently in Young Men and Fire. Why? Because the reason Maclean was drawn to that story, the Custer story, he had no interest in heroizing Custer. He had no interest in relitigating, was it right what happened to Custer? He said, I wanted to study defeat. And when he said that, he wasn't just thinking of Custer, because as you well know, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, in many ways, the indigenous participants suffered eclipse as well. And so that's one of his kind of key themes here. So this is just to say that Maclean is very self-conscious about connecting to the Custer myth here, suggesting there was a moment when the indigenous people actually had a moment of triumph. They triumphed over Custer, but in the end, they too suffered defeat. And I mentioned the Norman Maclean Reader here because it has these excerpts from the Custer manuscripts. Incredible. Actually, really cool writing, really good writing. And I kind of wish Maclean had published it, actually. Now, in addition to that, Maclean makes a point, or I should say the narrator makes a point, of telling us of the state, the condition of indigenous people at this moment. Remember, it's 1937, and this is a very haunting, a very blunt, a very honest account. And we have many, many, many accounts of how Native Americans were forced, as he says here, to live out by the city limits and generally pitching camp near a slaughterhouse or a city dump. So it's not as though Maclean's only interested in quote-unquote historical indigenous peoples. He wants to recognize what's happening to them now. And then, of course, the Macleans, proud Scots. So he brings in the Scots here. And this is one of the, to me, the funniest stories in A River Runs Through It. Remember, there are 4 fly fishing trips. And on the second trip, that's when Neil, the narrator's brother-in-law, joins them. They go up the Elkhorn and fish up there. And things don't go well. And we'll see a little bit of evidence of that later. But anyway, the point of this excerpt is notice how Maclean telling about how they ended up on the Elkhorn and how his brother-in-law Kenny could get them up the river. It's all about the Scots. Why? The Scots got there early. Why? Because they knew how to deal with mountains in cold weather. And aren't we all thinking of Ivan Doig right now and Dancing with the Rascal Fair and House of Sky, etc. So I love this moment. And again, it's a moment I read by in the past when I was obsessed with, say, the tragedy, or I was obsessed with the beautiful prose. I would miss moments like that. That's a really interesting kind of throwaway line. Now we turn to arguably one of the most important aspects of Maclean's relationship with Montana. And we already know, remember the excavation, right? We start in 37, and he is fishing with his brother Paul. And then we go back to 27, and he's working in the logging camp along the Blackfoot River. And what we discover is that this is the company logging camp. And I'm just going to read just a little bit of it. The company owned them body and soul. It owned the state of Montana, the press, the preachers, etc. The grub was lousy, and likewise the wages, which the company took right back from them anyway by overpricing everything at the commissary. And they had to buy from the commissary out in the woods. Where else could they buy? This is an amazing photograph. And this could well be the very camp where Maclean worked in 27. This now is 29. It's at one of the logging camps being run by the Anaconda Copper Company. It's near Greeno, not specifically in Greeno. And I want you just to study that for a few minutes, because those are pretty rough and tumble conditions, aren't they? That's pretty rough out there. Now, Maclean always claimed he loved the hard work of living in Montana. He loved all that hard handwork. He loved actually cutting the trees. He loved doing the packing. He loved that stuff. But here's the problem. He said many times he had to leave Montana because he would not live under the thumb of the Anaconda Copper Company. And he put it very simply, and I think in very telling terms. He said, really, the Anaconda Copper Company unmanned him. It took away his independence. It took away his ability to choose his own direction. And in truth, Maclean was encouraged to go to the University of Montana, at that time Montana State, and he said, no, I won't go. Why? Because Anaconda Copper is actually picking the professors. And I'm not going to work for a newspaper in Montana because every newspaper's basically got the copper collar around it. So I find this extremely interesting and insightful. I think we understand the critique. But also I think it helps us understand why he ended up in Chicago, which for a long time he struggled to belong there. And he had to really convince himself that Chicago had many of the same kind of appeals as Montana. So for example, he loved going for long walks in Chicago, fell in love with the lake, fell in love with the local characters. But Anaconda Copper, no. He could not work in a state, live in a state. And I've always wondered if kind of almost subconsciously he blamed the company even for Paul's death. Now be clear, Paul died in Chicago. He did not die in Montana. But many of Paul's habits, gambling, right? Extreme drinking, getting into fights, etc. Many of those, I suspect he thinks, went back to the fact he was a reporter who was trying to uncover, resist Anaconda Copper. And then the United States Forest Service. And this is so interesting, and I'll just let you read that for yourselves, but this is so interesting because according to Maclean, this was the one path not taken that he often regretted. He often wished he had gone, he had joined the United States Forest Service, and he'd become one of those firefighters slash packers slash fire lookouts slash, very talented all around guy who could hang in the woods. He really loved it. He really loved it. And I think that's, by the way, why I think USFS 1919 is such a great story, because I feel like Maclean is fully invested in that. He loved the Forest Service, right? By the way, he often said that the 1910 Big Burn was the making of the Forest Service, and of course I guess we'd agree with that, because after that catastrophe, which his family lived through indirectly, after that catastrophe, the Forest Service was much needed. I love this photo. This is an image of a packer going to a lookout in the Selway Bitterroot wilderness area. And it's really hard to overstate how much Maclean admired packers. He thought they were geniuses, particularly the very good ones. And of course, in UFSF 1919, he knows the best. Before everything goes to heck in Hamilton. And then, of course, there's this heartbreaker. It is so interesting how Maclean kind of smuggles in, returns, folds in these events that kind of keep recurring to him. The Man Gulch Fire of 1949, which of course is the spur, the source of Young Men and Fire. You probably know this, but he actually got to the site of the fire shortly afterwards. He saw it raw, if you will, and was always haunted by it. And so this is kind of a doubly interesting passage, right, as we think about how history is embedded in these stories. He mentions Man Gulch, and then this shift that occurs in the last sentence that's kind of interesting. The truck emerged out of the storm as if out of the pioneer past, looking like a covered wagon besieged by circling rain, right? So always looking for those kind of, as it were, antecedents or predecessors for himself. This is, without a doubt, one of the most haunting images out of Montana history. I bet most of you have seen it. It's reproduced in Young Men and Fire. It's the scene of collecting the dead after the fire. So, And then I have to mention this. Now, I want to be clear before I read this. I went to high school in Great Falls. I want to say that. So when I read this, you'll see why I say that. We regarded it as a family river, as a part of us, and I surrender it now only with great reluctance to dude ranches, the unselected inhabitants of Great Falls, and the Moorish invaders from California. Okay, you can help me with this. Why does he say unselected people from Great Falls? Anybody catch the pun there? Great Falls Select Beer, exactly. Great Falls Select Beer, so that's the allusion. That's the reference there. And to be fair to Norman, he frequently said, there were good people from Great Falls too, but for some reason he particularly picked on Great Falls. I don't quite know why. I think we get the dude ranches part of it, why he might be frustrated. So this, of course, is 1974, 75, the very moment he's writing these great stories. He's looking around him, and he's just perplexed, bothered, annoyed. And this is one of the passages, actually, that feeds in most directly into my concerns about contemporary Montana, because he's really showing us here how conflict is emerging as we have newcomers coming into the state with diverse motives. The Moorish invaders from California is pretty good, and that's pretty good. So anyway, so he did call these people out, and as you probably know, Maclean was kind of a grumpy fellow, and he did this fairly often, actually. He didn't mind calling folks out. Okay, so to sum up, what is the history that is embedded in A River Runs Through It? And I want to say again, guys, this is my select account. There are many, many little filaments in there that you can find if you start looking for it. And so you can see now, I call it the archaeology of A River Runs Through It, because it goes from the contemporary, the 70s, with those apostates from Great Falls and California, down to the basement rock, the Precambrian mudstones, and then their timeless words. But you know what? He summarized all that a lot better than I can, right? He said it pretty well. And I have to read these words because, yeah. I actually thought about trying to get the clip of the actor it's actually Robert Redford, who says these words in A River Runs Through It. Because if you don't tear up when he says these words, eventually all things merge into one, eventually all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of those rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I am haunted by waters. Gorgeous. And he basically summarizes everything I just said in those few words. Okay, now I'm going to pose the question. You may be sitting there thinking, all fine and good, Ken, you've showed us, yes. Oh, gotcha. All fine and good, Ken, you've showed us these various historical elements that are in A River Runs Through It. That's kind of cool. So we can read for tragedy, we can read for great art, we can read for history. That's cool. So what I want to suggest is that Maclean embedded all that history with a particular motive or theme in mind. And this is my reading of it. I have a hunch others will find other meaning or significance to the historical content. Time and again, Maclean said, the problem of self-identity is not just a problem for the young, it is a problem all the time, perhaps the problem. So Maclean is very direct, and he says, I did a lot of my writing in A River Runs Through It in order to figure out who I am, to discover who I am. And part of that is surely this deep history of the place where he and his family landed in the early 20th century, where he developed this incredibly intense, deep personal relationship connection to that place. But I want to be a little more specific. It's not just identity, it's masculine identity. And he comes back to this frequently. Bill Beavis, one of my great teachers at the University of Montana, Bill put it well, how may Western man be saved? So this is the very dilemma, the problem, I argue, that Maclean is taking on as he brings in all this history. he actually came up with a resolution, and he repeated this story many times. And I want to be clear that, to me, this story grossly oversimplifies both his parents. But it was such a good story, and he could see whenever he told the story, everybody kind of, ooh, that's a pretty good story. So I think he kept telling it because he's a good storyteller. Fundamentally, his greatest hero was Charlie Russell. He thought Russell was the best storyteller ever, and he wanted to be Charlie Russell. So anyway, you can read that for yourselves, but the punchline is, I ended up being a tough flower girl. And what he's trying to account for is his incredible talent as a teacher, a writer, an administrator. That incredible talent combined with all that toughness that he developed in Montana, right? And by the way, even as he aged, people noted this about Maclean, he never stopped being just a little bit scary to his Chicago colleagues. And just to be clear, I mean, he was very close, very dear friends. They often adored him, etc. But he often scared them a little bit because he had that toughness, that edge, that vulgarity, if you will, that he was not afraid of. All right, so here's the big wrap-up, guys. Here's my big wrap-up. What is all this leading to? All that history, he's taking on the problematic of what it means to be a young man who can flourish and survive in Montana. Maclean secularized his father's Presbyterian teachings. Maclean was openly, avowedly agnostic. Can you imagine being a PK, a preacher's kid, and being just openly agnostic? And it created a weird kind of tension, but affection between Norman and his father. It's very touching. Human beings are shaped by their environment, obviously. That is how human beings develop their personalities, their cultures, their habits. Young men in Montana flourish or fail by adapting to their historical, geographic, and biological settings. So how do you anchor in? How do you respond to these stimuli? How do you adapt or resist? While Paul achieved grace through fly fishing, and those, of course, are many of the most beautiful moments in A River Runs Through It, he achieved grace through fly fishing. His stubborn self-reliance proved ill-equipped to save him away from the Blackfoot River, and hence he is beaten to death. You'll remember just a gripping moment. The father and the brother, the narrator, dwell on the fact that he'd broken his right wrist because, why? He had fought back, but he lost. He died. While only competent in the ways of fishermen, loggers, and packers, the narrator's tough flower girl persona enabled him to live to tell the tale, right? So if Paul was this hypermasculine, determined, stubborn, independent self, Norman, or the narrator rather, was able to combine the qualities of a tough flower girl. And in the end, I love this quote from Montana Ghost Dance. Basically, Maclean, by telling his story, tells our story, right? The big Blackfoot was Norman's bone country, his landscape of spirit and blood. In telling his story, his family's story of closeness and loss, he figured a way to tell our own. I think that's exactly right. And I think that's what a lot of that history is doing. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment. I promised you I'd show you the works cited, and I understand this is going to go by fast and you can't get all this. But again, feel free to email me at eganken@hotmail.com, and I'm happy to share this with you. What I'm emphasizing here, guys, is we're in a moment of incredible upsurge of quality criticism and scholarship about Norman Maclean. So we had just a wonderful burst in the 80s and 90s. Then I think it's fair to say that a lot of the scholarship went into kind of quiescence. It, quieted down. Now, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a new biography, right? And that's Rebecca McCarthy's Norman Maclean. We've had John Maclean's wonderful memoir, Home Waters, right? We've had this study of Maclean's style. And then we've had, well, the Norman Maclean reader is from 2008, but it's still a must-go-to item. So a lot of good work being done right now. I look forward to the big celebration of the 50th anniversary of its publication next year. I hope we'll all think about the history embedded in these great stories. And with that, I am open for questions, thoughts.
Thank you. And if you have questions, please raise your hand and I will come over with the mic.
I stunned them all. Yes.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. So talk a little bit maybe about the intersection of religion and fly fishing.
Yeah.
I'm an avid fly fisherman myself, and it's somewhat meditative in a way. And so I really like that part of, I never read the book, but I've seen the movie probably 100 times. I own it. So.
Yeah. Very good. So you recall the great opening line, right? In our family, there was no line between fly fishing and religion, etc. And this is where the whole issue of Norman's relationship with his father's religion is so interesting. And actually, I'm going to go back and see if I can recover this moment quickly. If not, I'll try to get to it now. It's going to take a bit. I guess I won't do that. But anyway, that wonderful moment where Maclean says in so many words, oh, here we go. There it is. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. So that was the Reverend Maclean's view of what was happening. And you'll recall that over and over again in the opening pages of A River Runs Through It, we're reminded that human beings, man is a damn mess. He's a damn mess. And if you want to know that he's a damn mess, watch someone fly casting for the first time. And I can be very personal about this. I love fly fishing, but I'm not especially great at it, and I'm still a damn mess. Okay, anyway, but the point is, there are moments, though, if you follow that 4-count rhythm and you actually enter into a full understanding of the river, the fish, the scene, the context, you can achieve moments of grace. But for Norman Maclean, the writer, they were not, as it were, metaphysical or religious grace. They were artistic grace. And by the way, I should underline that. Paul is connected to the loggers and the packers that Maclean admired so much. Why? Because they all possess this grace, right? And I have to tell you, I think right at the heart of Maclean's writing, and that includes both River and Young Men and Fire, is this unending, irresolvable question about whether there is some underlying meaning and pattern to reality that we briefly glimpse through a moment like Paul's extraordinary shadow casting. And in the end, I don't think he can go there. He cannot conclude there's an underlying deity, an underlying kind of metaphysical force that's doing that. Instead, we project that as human beings onto it. Having said all that, I think those passages describing fly fishing are as meditative and gorgeous and serene in many ways as anything ever written. And I really like the movie, I do, but I gotta tell you, the book, read the book, yes. Other questions, thoughts, yes?
Just a thought,
One second.
any comments on nostalgia? I mean, is there a link, the link between Maclean and the television drama Yellowstone and all these people wanting to move here? They're seeking nostalgia.
Yes, yeah, very, very good. What I think, this is a great point, because obviously nostalgia is driving a Yellowstone as much as A River Runs Through It. And so the question becomes, are they the same kind of nostalgia? Do they have the same underlying motive or direction or goal? And I truly believe that Maclean would argue that he is representing, dramatizing human beings actually interacting with the environment and coming up with practices, arts, that allow them to flourish, survive in this very difficult environment. I think it's fair to say he does not like grandstanding masculinity. Whatever you say about Yellowstone, guys, can we agree that John Dutton is a little bit of a grandstander, that he's sort of like, not to mention his ranch hands who keep taking other ranch hands off to kill them? It's a very strange story. So my point is, I think Maclean would argue that he's getting at a kind of realistic understanding of masculinity in earlier times. Having said that, I do agree with your impulse there that there are moments I'm reading Maclean and I think he so desperately wants to get back to that earlier moment. And you feel it in that line about the unselected citizens of Great Falls and the Moorish invaders from California. He wants to protect his wonderland from those invaders. But it's kind of an amusing thought to imagine Norman Maclean reviewing Yellowstone. And I don't think it'd be nice. I don't think it'd be good. I think it'd be nice. Other questions, thoughts, surprises?
Thank you very much. Very enjoyable. It's been a long time since I read A River Runs Through It, but I've recently become interested in Ivan Doig's writings, and specifically English Creek, where you have two brothers, similar sort of pathways, the Forest Service, fire. Can you speak to a similarity or common, or how each might have influenced the other?
That is a wonderful question. And I'm embarrassed to say I never thought about the connection, and I bet it's there. Maclean always expressed admiration for Doig, and Doig expressed admiration for Maclean. And surely, obviously English Creek published, 84 maybe? So about 8 years after A River Runs Through It. I love the comparison. Now, there is an important shift there. It's the older brother, Alec, in English Creek, who ultimately comes to, I've got to be careful here. How many people have read English Creek? I don't want to, quite a few of you, but not everybody. Anyway, it's fair to say that Alec is the Paul of the story, let's put it that way. Whereas Jick is the younger brother who's observing his older brother, right? But they're in this kind of, to use a fancy word, kind of a dyad where they are counterpoints to each other, the two brothers. They bring out animosity in each other. They bring out love in each other. It's interesting because in many ways, Jick is learning from Alec, particularly his romantic life. And I think it's fair to say that Norman, or the narrator, I have to say, I should be clear, guys, I keep kind of confusing Norman and the narrator. Understand that in the film version of A River Runs Through It, the narrator's named Norman. In the novel itself, it's just the narrator. It's not called Norman. Anyway, but it's fair to say that the narrator in A River Runs Through It is observing Paul, who has a highly active love life, we will say that. And there's a part of the narrator that admires it, is frightened by it. He sees it as part of Paul's kind of hypermasculinity that's leading him to conflict and danger. Beyond that, very interesting because the McCaskills, they have a ranch on the Rocky Mountain front. By the way, have I mentioned that may be my favorite Ivan Doig novel? I love that novel. I really do. I think part of it is, for some reason, I think Doig as writer completely entered into those characters. So anyway, those are some initial sketches or thoughts, but you got me thinking. I'm going to go back and revisit, I'm going to revisit English Creek, and I'm actually going to start digging around in Doig papers, and I'm going to see whether Ivan, whether he, so, yes, back here.
Could you talk a little about the conversation between Norman and his dad when they're trying to figure out whether either of them could have saved Paul?
Oh my gosh. I think among other elements of the story of A River Runs Through It is that you have these two highly intelligent, very cultured, very tough men, father and older brother, and they so desperately want to help Paul. And there's this really poignant moment late in the novel, shortly before Paul dies, where the father says in so many words, it's often the people you're closest to that you can never understand and never help. And for this brilliant preacher to come to that conclusion and realize this is a conversation that apparently took place before Paul's death. For him to come to that conclusion, that realization, it's just such a heartbreaker. On the other hand, guys, don't we all have family members or friends kind of like that? I think we do. I think we do. And what Paul does constantly throughout A River Runs Through It, I would argue that he teases his brother and his father, and he says sometimes what the brother or the son wants is for someone just to want to help him. And that's, that's sweet, but that's not effective. I mean, oh, fine, you want me to care about it, I'm happy to care, but how can I save you? Can I save you? And in so many words, they can't save him. And that haunting close where they hear the words beneath the rocks. It goes back to the religious question that was raised, a very good question. And in the Bible, in the book of John, the Logos, the Word is the Word of God. It's the organizing principle, if you will, of the universe. And in this, A River Runs Through It, the words are in many ways the words of those who are gone or departed. It's the human words. And in a sense, what Maclean is doing through A River Runs Through It is resurrecting or, if you will, excavating those words. So words like that, where Paul says, maybe what he likes is you're wanting to help him. But where does that leave the narrator at the end of the story? I didn't save you. Could I have saved you? Was there a way to save you? So, yeah. Other thoughts, questions?
Thank you. You mentioned Lewis taking the trip along the Blackfoot. Is that an identified trail? Is it marked?
Yes.
And so the person could find it?
Yes, that's the cool thing about John Maclean's book, Home Waters. He dedicates a whole section to helping us to find or trace the trail. And I want to reinforce, it was called The River of the Road to the Buffalo. And so we're talking about tribes, nations, tribal nations on the western side of the mountains who follow the Blackfoot to get, obviously, to the plains where the bison are. And by the way, they also followed the Clark Fork River. And in fact, that was in some ways the easier route. It was a wider route. But anyway, so Lewis is basically coached up by the Nez Perce, guided by who? Sacagawea, right? And she says, you can go up that way, up that road, and that's how you're going to get to the Marias River, which will take you back to the Missouri, which will take you back to Clark. They meet up at the junction of the Yellowstone and the Missouri River. So yes, and so if you get Home Waters by John Maclean, and you just carefully read that. And again, I want to stress, I've only gone to 2 or 3 of the sites so far. If I'm completely honest with you, I was hoping to do it this past week, but the weather was dreadful, so I didn't do it. So I hope to do it this summer. But he points out, John Maclean does, that there are cairns. You can find actual cairns that still exist. You can find the trail at points, kind of the shadow of the trail where they were probably dragging or they were bringing horses or whatever. So yeah, I think it's worth giving it a shot. Yeah. So, but just to be clear, I haven't done it yet. Hope to do it. So, yes.
I'll add to that. It's basically Montana 200, and there's spots along the way, signage. Meriwether Lewis named what's now Moncher Creek outside of Ovando.
That's right. Very good.
He named it after his Newfie, Seaman the dog. Which I guess brings me, I do a lot of scholarship on Lewis and Clark, and it's interesting that for a lot of Lewis and Clarky people, they come to A River Runs Through It not just because of rivers and place, but the relationship. And for those who don't know what happens to Meriwether Lewis after the expedition, Clark and Lewis is the Paul, and it comes up in conversation a lot of afterwards. Clark is the one who can move on, start a family. Lewis is the one who falls into drinking and probably gambling and meets a pretty horrific end.
Very good. Thank you so much. I hadn't thought of that. That's brilliant. I'm going to use it. Can I steal it? Yeah. Thank you. I don't have to cite you, do I? I'm serious. That's wonderful. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you.
I was in college with him. I just wanted to say that the Dartmouth connection illuminates his religious experience quite well, I think. One of his classmates was Joseph Campbell, for example.
Ah, very good.
Another of his classmates was Dr. Seuss, and you can just only imagine what that brought on. But if you look at what he's talking about in fly fishing and other things, how he's able to push it into those elements, you can see Campbell quite clearly.
Very nice. Keep it coming, guys. Come on. You're helping me write this. I need this. Thank you. Actually, that's brilliant, Kathleen. Thank you.
Okay, well, that is probably a great place to end it because we are at time. So feel free to come up if you have further pending questions.
Yeah.
But thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Ken.
It's fun. It's fun. Thank you.